Hello, welcome to the Vandal Factory podcast. I'm Henry Raby, and this is a special Factory Floor Cuts episode. In the normal episodes of the Vandal Factory podcast, myself and co-host Natalie Quatermass interview some very clever, special, wonderful guests who talk about art and activism, and we usually have to do a bit of editing to make them all fit into one podcast episode. So that's where the Factory Floor Cuts come in, where we present to you the full unedited interview. Well, maybe a little bit edited. In this episode, you will hear from Amber Massie-Blomfield. Amber has written an incredible book about arts and activism across history, about the artists who have treated the protest site as their canvas and contributed to movements that have transformed history. So, pick up Acts of Resistance wherever you can at your local independent bookshop. If you want to hear a song that Amber chose, you can head to episode number 29, which originally featured our interview with Amber. If you're interested in more conversations about arts and activism, we talked to theatre director Dermot Daly on episode number 3. There is a Factory Floor Cuts episode featuring Keith Sahar from 20 Stories High. And generally just subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love you to join the Vandal Factory family. Okay, on with the interview.
Hi.
Welcome, Amber. Thank you so much for coming on the Vandal Factory podcast.
Oh, it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
It's all right. So you have a vast CV that is stupendously impressive. And I'm going to send, everyone can go away and just Google how impressive your CV is. But can you summarize who you are?
Yeah, well, I'm principally, my sort of bread and butter is as a theatre producer. So I've worked with a lot of different theatre companies. Most recently, I was the executive director of Complicité for a few years. I was the executive director at Camden People's Theatre for a little while, and I'm currently doing some work with Actors Touring Company, who specialise in bringing international plays into the UK. And then I have a practice as a writer as well, and really my writing is about the meeting point of arts and the world in different ways, and it's kind of really connected to my theatre producing, because very often it's me going, what on earth am I doing with my life? and I'm working it out on the page and hoping that some other people will find that interesting. So it's kind of combines kind of memoir and cultural criticism and a little bit of history and discovery as well.
I need to remind myself regularly that writing is a practice, and it is something we do to process and to sort things out in our brain. That's certainly how I feel often.
And I think if you can sort of have that attitude that you're going to make sure you bring some benefit to yourself by doing it, then I don't know, it sort of helps you not worry too much about who's going to read it and whether it's going to be a big success or not. And actually you're doing it for yourself. And actually I think that makes the writing more genuine too, for me.
Is that something you went into Acts of Resistance thinking, actually, I want to write this for me? And then, if you get to share those stories, that's a bonus. Wow.
Yeah.
So, you talk about Acts of Resistance, we should clarify what that is. So we have it right here, an actual physical book.
This is also an uncorrected proof, so we could get it on eBay and it'd be worth £1 million.
Whoa.
All the time is in it.
So your amazing new book that's just come out is called Act of Resistance, The Power of Art to Create a Better World. Oh boy, you are in the perfect place. We are so excited Henry's plows through quite a lot of it already, and I've dipped. I'll be honest, I've dipped, and it feels like every page
you can dip.
Yeah, I've every page I open it on feels very quotable. But why didn't you tell us about what inspired you? You've said, it's about how you're processing and working out your own creative practice. But what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I started working on this book in 2018, which feels like a lifetime ago. And, it really did. That was when I was working at Camden People's Theatre. And I don't know if you've you're familiar with it at all, but it's sort of studio theatre close to central London. It's got an amazing programme of art that feels pretty political very often, pretty kind of left-leaning, I would say, pretty out there and experimental. And it was such an amazing, vibrant place to work. I had some of the happiest years of my career there. But, you know, we were sort of, you know, there was a long time where I just thought, oh, you know, I took it for granted that what we were doing mattered, and that, you know, it was really powerful that these pieces of work were being made. And I just think there was, you know, there was that shift in 2016 where it just felt like the world got really bad and there was Brexit and Trump getting elected. And, you know, so that summer of 2018, it was just, you know, like really hot summer as well, and you know, with global warming and everything that was happening. And I just really got to thinking about, I guess I got a little bit despondent. I was thinking, you know, does it matter what I'm really doing with my life? You know, can't I be doing something more direct and powerful and important than, you know, sitting in this studio theatre with about 60 people coming in of a night and watching this experimental theatre? And so that was really, those were the questions that really sparked this journey. I was also very inspired by a book called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, which I don't know if you've come across, but it's like the most amazing book about activists who've made real change. And actually it kind of is a brilliant book to read if you're just like, oh, activism can't change anything, because she goes, look, here's all the people that can. And I was like, well, I need this book for art, and I better write it then, hadn't I? So yeah, that was really it. And I just started researching. The first story I really got engaged with was about Susan Sontag and waiting for Godot during the siege of Sarajevo, which just seemed like, you know, Susan Sontag was a fascinating person to write about, because she was someone who thought so deeply in her life about the purpose and the meaning of art. And then there was this very real example where she'd gone to Sarajevo and sort of in the midst of the siege worked with the local theatrical community to make a production of Waiting for Godot in the middle of, you know, the rubble, with, you know, audiences coming through shell fire to be there and sit there and watch it by candlelight. And, you know, it was such a, I couldn't get that image of it out of my head. And so that was where I really started going, well, what were they all doing there? Did it matter? You know, was it a complete waste of her time to go out and do that? You know, and that was really where I got into it.
Yeah, so something, go on.
I was going to say, what struck me in that chapter specifically was the sniffiness around the Western press of saying, oh, what's all this about? She thinks she can go out there and make a difference, or we'd be better off sending medical aid than sending artists. But the quote that really stood out for me is someone who remembered it, I think, telling you that it was about defending civilization. And we actually had a long conversation about, well, what is civilization? Because sometimes people say we're civilized when, you know, we're Western powers that do horrible things around the world. But what I took that meaning of saying is that art as resistance is saying that we create a better world. We're civil, and we're hopeful and joyful and human, and we're not falling to the chaos and the
baseline of violence.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, and there's something really interesting. I mean, there's loads to that, but I think there's something really interesting if you look at what's happening in Gaza now, and, you know, so many situations of genocide. Actually, you know, a real weapon of genocide is an attack on culture, and the kind of, you know, the insistence on people not as humans, as animals, you know, and that kind of language that gets used around this. And so actually, I think, you know, the people from Sarajevo, and actually on Saturday, I was chairing a panel discussion with some theatre makers from Palestine at the Royal Court. And it was, you know, they were talking about how very important it was for them to keep making art, to retain this sense of humanity in the face of, you know, forces that are completely trying to reduce their dignity and their humanity. And I find that a really beautiful idea. And I think, you know, those of us that are in the privileged position of not having to worry about being shot when you're walking down the street, you know, probably browbeat about, does art really matter, and is it really privileged to think this? But then suddenly these people in this situation just, you know, take it for granted that it matters and that it's important, and they don't have time for that browbeating about, you know, what it's all about. So I find that really moving.
So we're completely coincidentally, we've also interviewed Miriam from Batjella,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so she will be the other guest on this same podcast.
Oh, no way. That's
Um,
brilliant.
so
That's really
when we
cool.
saw it on your social media, we are like, "Wow,
It's
that's
all coming together. Oh, well, she's so inspiring. And I mean, just, she was talking on Saturday. Well, I won't steal her thunder too much, but she was talking about her colleagues that are in Gaza now and that are working with school children, school age children, running drama workshops with them. And, them saying, oh, well, isn't it dangerous to get all these children gathered in the same place? But their colleagues in Gaza saying, it's dangerous whatever happens, and this is giving them a reason to smile, and they have so few reasons to smile, and that's so powerful.
yeah." When she was talking, the phrase that kept coming to my mind was, "Give us bread and give us roses." Oh, give us bread and give us roses,
Yeah.
and that need for quality. It's not
Yeah.
just about surviving. There needs to be a reason to survive.
And you might come across on Instagram the Gaza Free Circus, which I find so moving that they're sharing all these videos of, in the middle of these displacement camps where it's just all completely sandblasted, windswept, people are starving, but they're putting on clowning routines and they're putting on, red noses and performing juggling routines and acrobatics for the children. And what a beautiful thing to do in that context. I'm sorry, I find it quite emotional
Yeah,
to talk about
of
it.
course it is.
I wonder, Amber, in the context of the book, there are obviously some very hideous, awful scenarios that I'm sure you wouldn't want to go to, like the Sarajevo in the middle of a war and concentration camps. But are there any pieces of theatre that you were like, I wish I was there to see that or experience that or take that, and you wanted to
Oh, yeah.
witness it firsthand?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. I mean, it's not just theatre in the book, of course. It's very wide-ranging across different art forms. I mean, I think, yeah, all of them I would have loved to have, been party to. I mean, I think there's really great story about the Plastic People of the Universe, who are this kind of like prog rock band in the former Czechoslovakia, kind of at the end of the USSR, and they became complete sort of focal point for the kind of protest movement that was kind of fighting for freedom at that time. And yeah, I mean, they're kind of like, the brilliant part about that story is they didn't really ever see themselves as political. They were just sort of like wanted to make quite eccentric prog rock and wear their hair long and wear their kind of eccentric velvet suits and do their gigs with their kind of like tacky kind of UFOs that they'd built. And it's like really kind of discordant out there music, but like people were flocking in their thousands to go and see them, and this became a threat to the state because it was an expression of freedom and it was an expression of individual identity. And so they ended up being incarcerated. Václav Havel, who became the first president of the Czech Republic, spoke very specifically about how he took his inspiration from this kind of protest movement and what was sparked by people's desire for freedom because they went to see this band. So I think going to one of those gigs would have been pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. There's can you tell us a little bit more about the process of writing and how you must have come across so many examples, and I can only imagine that getting it down to how many have we got here? I mean, you've got part 1, 2, and 3, and there's 4 examples, then 3, then 3. You do the
That's
math.
10.
Okay, 10 examples.
Yeah. But then there's lots of sort of other stories kind of woven together through it.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of quite digressive that I kind of go off down my little rabbit holes as
So
I
you
go
haven't
through.
edited it down, is that what you're saying?
I
You
sort of
got them
like
all in there.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's like a lot of content that ended up on the cutting room floor, and there were some great stories that I was just like, it doesn't, I wrote some essays that were thousands of words long, and then I was just like, it doesn't quite make sense with the flow. But I mean, it was a difficult process because I started off imagining that I was going to go and do very in-depth in-person research, which I was able to do in Sarajevo. And I went out to Sarajevo and, met lots of the people who'd been there. And, I got to go to LA and Susan Sontag's archive in LA and see all of her faxes and everything that she sent, which was amazing. And then also I spent time on Jersey as well, researching Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who are this amazing queer visual arts making couple who sort of staged this amazing underground creative resistance to the Nazi occupation of Jersey. So I spent time out there and lots of time in the archive, and actually met someone who'd known them when he was a young man and sort of had memories of them. So I was doing that very in-depth research, and then the kind of pandemic hit, and I was suddenly like, oh my God, do I have to give this project up? But I actually I interviewed a writer called Nancy Campbell, who's a nature writer, and she wrote a book called 50 Words for Snow. And she's a travel writer who's given up on flying, but she's actually decided that this is going to allow her to write much more expansively about the world. And I was really inspired by that, to think, well, actually, if I'm stuck at home in my room and I can't go out anywhere, then I can write about anything I want to, actually. And so it made the scope much broader. And I interviewed a member of the Ucumau group in Bolivia, who I definitely wouldn't have been able to go out and meet them and see their work, and Alexis Wright, who's Indigenous Aboriginal writer in Australia. So it just allowed that breadth to expand. And then I had a baby, and it slowed everything down. And that's why I started in 2018, and here we are in 2024. But it's sadly, it's become more and more pertinent, and it does feel more urgent now than ever.
It certainly does. And something we talk about on every single episode is hope and anger being the two fuels that keep us artists and activists going, and you need those two things in equal measure, and they vary day to day on how hopeful and how angry you're feeling. Not all, and sometimes both together, and sometimes but depleted together. But again, it's something that just bounces off every page. It's like you were saying with Hope in the Dark. We're in very, very dark times, and so the need for angry, hopeful resistance, and those being performative, and not just performative, but visual, and telling stories that we can see and express, and finding different ways to tell stories that are acts of resistance, just feels all the more important. Like that, basically, if you're not doing that, it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, that's, for me, there's a really interesting role for art within activism, actually, is to bring some joy to activism, and to say, you're allowed to find joy in your creativity within this context. And, I talked a bit about going on the Palestinian protests, and there's an amazing sound system called Pulse for Palestine that are always on the London marches. And if you catch up with them, you just have you have a great time on the protest, and you those two things can sit alongside each other, that you can feel the horror and the overwhelm, and just the profound grief about what's happening, but at the same time you can also recognize there's something so beautiful in this kind of solidarity that you're forming with other people in this community. And art and music and theater and all those art forms can really give expression to that, I think, in an amazing way.
My friend was on a panel recently about art and activism, and she dropped me a message, and she said, what are your thoughts on this? And I was like, here's where I am at the moment, as a bit of a provocation, right? And this is just me being like a bit naughty and punky. I don't really believe this, but you said before about Camden People's Theatre and about 60 people coming through the door versus a big demonstration where potentially thousands of people can see something. And so my provocation is, actually, artists, we shouldn't be necessarily thinking what's the next studio show that we're going to take up to Edinburgh Fringe. It's actually saying, how can we get out into the streets, where we've been out with banners and people have clapped us and people have called us wankers. And I that's a exciting response more than than Guardian readers who are of the same value and the same opinion going, yeah, okay, that's interesting, and then walking away. That's my provocation. Obviously, take a show to Edinburgh if you want, listeners. Have a lovely time. Do the studio work. I'm not knocking that at all. That's my sort of where I'm at, thinking about what seems to be getting a message out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in an ideal world, it's kind of not either or, is it? It's kind of both and. And I think, that what I've kind of increasingly come to understand about art and activism is and change, and how political change comes, is it's not like one person coming up with the perfect artwork or the perfect gesture of protest that kind of transforms everything. It's kind of everyone finding their own way into it and finding their position of strength and their position of joy and what they thrive at because they're passionate about it. I mean, I would definitely agree with you that I would like to see more of an orientation towards protest context. And I think, one of my big heroes in the book and in life is Jay Jordan, I don't know if you're familiar with Jay Jordan, but you should definitely interview them. They're like a god of arts activism. But they talk about the real need for artists to kind of embed themselves in protest movements and like understand how change comes. And I think, Extinction Rebellion, I know people have different perspectives on Extinction Rebellion, but it has been enormously powerful in shifting the dial in terms of public discourse about climate. And creativity and art has been absolutely woven into every aspect of that. And it's a really big part of the story of the change that's been made by Exile. And so, yeah, I'm sort of with you on that point, more on the protest, on the demo, on the march, but a place for all of it, really.
I mean, so this book, writing this book has been a long process, and so much has changed for you. What are you coming away with now that it's physical? This must feel amazing, by the way. Whenever I speak to a writer, I'm just like, you made a thing.
I know,
Yes,
that's it, isn't it? It's
you made
great.
a
It's really
thing.
great. Yeah, no, that's a lovely feeling.
What does it feel like to I guess, what does it feel like to write a book? But that's just me projecting.
It's
But
so,
also, what are you really taking away from the last 8 years?
gosh. Well, I think I think to the first point, it's really interesting when you're a theatre person because, when you work in theatre, you're so used to kind of having the press night and everything orientates towards the press night, and you've got everyone in the room and you can like see the whites of their eyes and you can work out what they thought about it. And it's kind of all, made or not made, then you've got a sense of what you've got, whereas with a book you sort of have your launch party and everyone comes along and tells you you're great and has a glass of wine, but most of them haven't read the book yet, and then you sort of have this period when you're waiting for it to go out in the world and people to start reading it and people to start feeding back. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. And yeah, it's just really fascinating what kind of chimes with people and what stands out, and everyone comes back with a different story, or they'll quote something back to you where you're like, oh, I'd completely forgotten I'd written that, but that sounds good. So that's lovely that it's got that life that it takes on, and it's so different. And I think I'm really fascinated about kind of how different art forms move in the world as well, and also the political power of different art forms and what they can all do that's quite different. There was a second part to your question. I've forgotten what it was.
Yes. How are you a different Amber to the Amber who
Oh
started
yeah,
writing this
yeah.
book?
Well, I'm much more radical, and I wasn't.
Hey!
Yeah, I think I've got, I've always sort of been interested in activism, but I wasn't very committed activist before. I've become, I was an arts person who liked political art, but I wasn't really a person who went out on every single protest march. And, I really, really believe in protest now. And I really believe that activism can change things. And I think that art as part of activism can change things. And so, yeah, it's changed me in that way. It's enriched my life enormously. It's probably thrown up a lot of questions about contexts I will and won't work in that I wouldn't have had before, annoyingly. But yeah, I mean, it's made me want to give my life to this work, really. And that's really cool. And it
Amazing.
answered the question, you know, without any spoilers, but it did answer the question that I think art does matter, but maybe not in quite the way I thought it did when I started out.
Oh, interesting. That's so exciting, and I'm delighted to hear.
Yeah.
Imagine you've been like, lads, there's no point.
Yeah.
I'm gonna write
But
this
I think,
book to
you know,
prove it.
the interesting thing was I started out really wanting to sort of find these, you know, like I was saying before, these particular sort of single artworks where I could say, you know, that person made that film or that painting, and then this thing changed in the law. And I did sort of find a few stories like that, but actually I realized that that was kind of really, really reductive way to think about art and change. And actually there was such a
Not it, they are part of a movement, and movements are
exactly.
a mesh, a network of 1,000 different connections going on at all times, in the right moment, and a lot of luck, an awful lot of
Yeah,
luck and good
yeah,
timing. And I think half the time when things don't work, it's just down to luck. It's just down to the catching the tide at the right minute. And so you just, you fall in the water, you keep swimming, and then you get back on your surfboard. I'm running with this metaphor.
And the water's
Surfing.
full of far right sharks.
And there's a dolphin.
And the dolphin is justice.
Yes. Okay.
yes,
Good.
love it. But you know, so often when you talk about, you know, people who've been involved in actions or movements that have made real changes, you know, they didn't know until the moment it happened. They just sort of were persisting because they felt it was the right thing to do, you know. And I think exactly as you say, you know, unless we kind of keep building that surfboard slash wave slash whatever it is, keep riding it, then yeah, I'm getting lost in the metaphor here, but you
There's
know what I mean.
rafts. The surfboard, we make rafts with the surfboard, and we do that unlocking thing that I've seen them do. And there's a jellyfish. Anyway, it's great. It's great to talk to you, Amber.